4,000 feet below the surface, a submersible sonar catches something that should not be there. A whale skeleton, 65 feet long, resting in the dark for years. Around it, life explodes. Worms with blood-red gills, bacteria that breathe sulfur instead of air, a creature that eats bone with no mouth at all. This single skeleton will feed an entire community for 50 years, longer than most careers, longer than some marriages. You're about to see how one death builds a city in the dark, how a graveyard turns into a paradise, and how scientists found a hidden world floating just off the coast of Los Angeles. If deep sea mysteries pull you in, hit subscribe and stay close. This journey goes deeper than you think. The whale is gone. What it left behind is still alive. We begin. A blue whale drifts near the surface of the open Pacific, old and worn out after decades of life. Its heart, roughly the size of a small car, beats one final time and stops. The huge body goes still. For a moment, the ocean around it does not seem to notice. Waves roll past the way they always have. Then the change begins. Gases build up inside the body as it starts to decompose, and the corpse can float at the surface for days, sometimes weeks, drifting like a strange floating island. Sharks take bites from below. Seabirds land on top and pick at the exposed skin. Eventually, the trapped gases escape or the tissue gives way, and the balance tips. The whale begins to sink. It falls slowly at first, then picks up speed, spinning gently through water that grows darker with every 100 feet. Sunlight disappears completely by around 600 feet down. Below that line sits a permanent midnight, a place the sun has never once touched. The whale keeps falling through this blackness for long minutes, tumbling past fish that dart away in surprise and clouds of tiny drifting animals scattering from the shadow above them. Somewhere between 1,000 and 13,000 feet down, the body finally settles into soft sediment on the seafloor. Dust rises in a slow cloud and drifts sideways before settling again. To a human eye, this looks like a lonely grave in a place light will never reach again. Picture dropping a coin into a canyon so deep you never hear it land. That silence is exactly what greets the whale at the bottom, at least for the first few hours. The water at this depth feels almost nothing like the ocean most people picture. There's no current strong enough to stir sand into clouds. There's no warmth left at all, just a steady, bone-deep cold hovering barely above freezing. Pressure here would crush a soda can flat in an instant, hundreds of times stronger than the air pressing down on a person at sea level. Almost nothing about this place is built for comfort, and yet within hours it is about to become one of the busiest neighborhoods on the entire seafloor. Then something changes in the water. Oily compounds begin leaking from the body, spreading outward in an invisible cloud carried by slow, deep currents. The cloud drifts for miles without losing its strength, moving through total darkness like a signal broadcast on a frequency only certain animals can hear. Somewhere far off in the blackness, a nose built to catch the faintest scent picks up the trail and turns toward it without hesitation. Other animals notice too. Fish patrolling the open water above the seafloor veer off course, drawn downward by a smell their bodies have been built for generations to recognize. None of them know yet how big this particular meal really is. All they know is that the smell is strong, it is close, and it is worth investigating. A journey that began with a single heartbeat stopping is about to trigger one of the strangest chain reactions in the entire ocean, and the first guesses are already on the way. Picture the deep sea floor as the small town that has been rationing food for years. A shrimp might wait weeks between meals. A worm might go months. Almost none of that food comes from sunlight this deep, since nearly everything alive down here depends on scraps drifting down from the sunlit water far above, arriving thin and scattered like snow that melts before it lands. Now picture a fully stocked truck crashing through the middle of that town overnight. That is roughly what a sunken whale means to the deep sea floor. and it explains why one carcass can trigger an event unlike anything else down there. A single large whale can weigh close to 80,000 pounds. Scientists have calculated that one body this size can deliver as much organic material to a small patch of seafloor as thousands of years of the normal food drizzle combined, 2,000 years of meals compressed into a single delivery. This scale of food is rare enough on its own, but the whale offers something even more valuable to the deep sea: concentration. Instead of nutrients spread across miles of empty mud, everything arrives in one place, dense enough to support hundreds of thousands of animals at once. For comparison, a typical patch of abyssal seafloor might support a few dozen scattered creatures. A single whale fall can host a crowd rivaling the density of a busy coral reef. Word of a meal this size does not stay secret for long. Deep sea animals are built with extraordinarily sensitive systems for detecting chemical traces in water, some capable of tracking a scent for more than a mile through total darkness. Within hours of a whale settling onto the mud, the first search parties are already converging from every direction, summoned by a smell no ordinary meal could ever produce. Compare that to how a normal meal arrives on the deep sea floor. A dead fish might drift down and get eaten by a single passing scavenger within minutes, gone before word ever spreads. A whale is different. Its sheer size means the smell keeps leaking for days, weeks, even months, broadcasting an invitation that never quite switches off. Every creature that catches the scent becomes another messenger, another set of fins stirring the water and spreading the signal even further. Scientists comparing whale falls to other deep-sea food sources often use the word bonanza, a term usually reserved for gold rushes and lottery wins. That comparison is not an exaggeration. For an animal living on the abyssal plain, discovering a whale fall can genuinely be the equivalent of winning the biggest prize the ocean has to offer, a discovery that can change the fortune of an entire local population for years afterward. What arrives next will not look gentle. It will look like a feeding frenzy on a scale most people only picture happening near the surface, in daylight, with cameras rolling. Down here in total blackness, the feast is only just getting started, and the animals racing toward it have been waiting their whole lives for exactly this kind of opportunity. The first visitors to a whale fall belong to a group scientists call mobile scavengers, and they behave like a shift of night workers clocking in the moment the delivery truck arrives. Sleeper sharks usually show up first, moving slowly but with total purpose, drawn by the same chemical trail spreading through the water. Hagfish follow close behind, and they arrive in numbers that surprise almost everyone who sees it for the first time. Hundreds of these eel-like scavengers can crowd around a single carcass, burrowing directly into the body and feeding from the inside out, their sliding, boneless bodies squeezing into gaps no other predator could reach. Crabs scuttle in from the surrounding mud next, picking at torn flesh with careful mechanical claws. Giant isopods join them, strange armored creatures that look like a pillbug scaled up to the size of a house cat, ancient looking and slow moving but relentless once they reach a meal this large. Together this crew works with startling speed. A 40-ton whale can lose tens of thousands of pounds of soft tissue in a matter of months, sometimes even weeks, stripped down to bone and connective tissue by mouth, built specifically for exactly this kind of opportunity. In an environment where meals normally come in tiny scattered crumbs, this stage looks almost violent by comparison, a feeding event on a scale the surrounding seafloor rarely if ever witnesses. What makes this different from an ordinary shark feeding frenzy near the surface is timing. In shallow water, scavengers clean up a carcass and life moves on within days. On the deep sea floor, the mobile scavenger stage is only the opening act, a fast and messy prologue to something that will last far longer than anyone watching the first bite could possibly guess. Watching this stage unfold on camera, researchers notice something almost orderly about the chaos. Sleeper sharks tend to feed in the open, tearing at exposed muscle along the whale's back and sides. Hagfish prefer the enclosed spaces, sliding through the mouth, the gill slits, and any wound already torn open, working from the inside where competition is thinner. Crabs and isopods pick through what both groups leave behind, cleaning smaller scraps from between exposed ribs. Nothing about this feast is wasted, and every creature seems to have found its own particular way of getting a share. Once the flesh is gone, most people would assume the story ends there. The leftover bones picked clean and forgotten, another meal finished the way meals near the surface usually are. Scientists studying whale falls in the 1990s discovered exactly the opposite. The mobile scavengers moved on to search for their next meal elsewhere, leaving behind a skeleton that looked, to any casual observer, like nothing more than debris. Divers and researchers who have watched this stage on camera describe an almost eerie shift once the scavengers finally leave. The frantic motion stops, the water clears. What remains looks, for a brief window, like the quiet aftermath everyone expects from a feeding event, a stripped skeleton settling into stillness on the mud. That skeleton was anything but finished. The real transformation was only beginning, and it would take a very different kind of visitor to reveal what the bones themselves still had to offer. Before 1987, most oceanographers pictured the deep sea floor as one of the emptiest places on the planet. A cold, dark desert where large, dramatic bursts of life simply did not happen. Submersibles exploring the deep abyssal plains, the vast flat stretches of mud covering most of the ocean floor, usually found scattered, thinly spread animals surviving on almost nothing. Exactly the kind of scarcity that word desert implies. This assumption was not unreasonable. Food this deep almost always arrives as the slow, steady drizzle from the sunlit water above. Tiny flecks of dead plankton and waste sinking down over days and weeks, most of it eaten before it even reaches bottom. Large, sudden, concentrated feasts seemed like they should be vanishingly rare. Brief accidents rather than a regular feature of deep ocean life. What nobody had properly accounted for was the scale of the largest animals ever to exist on Earth, and what happens to their bodies once they die. Blue whales, fin whales, sperm whales, and other great whales roam every ocean on the planet, and every single one of them eventually dies. Most of those deaths happen far from any human witness, and the bodies sink quietly into water. No submersible happens to be exploring at that exact moment. Scientists had simply never been in the right place at the right time to see what one of those deaths actually left behind. Submersible dives are expensive, slow, and limited to tiny patches of seafloor at a time. Mapping even a single square mile in detail can take an entire research trip, and the world's oceans cover more than 130 million square miles. Finding one specific skeleton hidden somewhere in that vast expanse without any clue where to look is closer to finding a single grain of sand on a beach the size of a country. The barren mud researchers kept mapping was real, but it was only telling half the story, missing the rare, scattered patches where whales' remains had transformed a small stretch of desert into something closer to an oasis. Without knowing to search for these patches specifically, there was no reason for anyone to expect they existed at all. Scientific instruments can only reveal what someone thinks to point them at, and nobody before 1987 had seriously considered pointing a sonar array at empty-looking mud in the hope of finding a decades-old whale skeleton underneath. Craig Smith's accidental 1987 discovery changed that picture permanently. What had looked like empty seafloor for decades turned out to be hiding pockets of astonishing biological activity, simply waiting for someone to stumble across the right patch of mud at the right depth. The lesson reached far beyond whales. If one overlooked assumption about the deep sea could hide something this dramatic, other assumptions about the ocean floor were probably worth questioning too. Researchers began treating the abyssal plain less like a settled subject and more like an unopened book. aware that entire chapters of deep sea life might still be sitting undiscovered simply because nobody had looked in the right place yet. The desert was never truly empty. It was full of oases nobody had known to look for, scattered across an ocean floor larger than every continent on Earth combined. Once the mobile scavengers finish their work and move on, a whale skeleton enters what scientists call the enrichment stage, and the shift in atmosphere is dramatic. The large, dramatic predators disappear almost entirely, replaced by an explosion of much smaller animals crowding onto every available surface of bone and surrounding sediment. Tiny shrimp-like crustaceans called amphipods swarm across the skeleton by the thousands, along with bristly polychaete worms threading through cracks in the bone, snails grazing along exposed surfaces, and countless other small invertebrates feasting on scraps of tissue and nutrient-rich sediment left behind by the earlier feeding stage. The density of life during this period can genuinely rival a coral reef, an astonishing comparison for a patch of seafloor that would normally support only a scattered handful of animals per square yard. Researchers studying these communities have counted populations in the hundreds of thousands crowding onto a single skeleton, a level of concentration almost nowhere else on the open abyssal plain. This stage tends to last considerably longer than the mobile scavenger phase, often stretching across several years rather than mere months. The smaller animals work more slowly through what remains, and the sediment surrounding the bone stays enriched with nutrients for a long stretch of time, continuing to support fresh generations of scavengers well after the original soft tissue has vanished. New arrivals keep showing up throughout this period, drawn less by the smell of flesh, which is mostly faded by now, and more by the sheer density of other small animals already gathered there. Predators find prey. Prey finds shelter among the crowd. An entire miniature food web stitches itself together around a structure that, only months earlier, was still swimming through open ocean, oblivious to the fact that its own remains would one day become a bustling neighborhood for thousands of creatures it never once encountered while alive. Picture an apartment complex going up almost overnight in a location everyone assumed was empty land, tenants moving in by the thousands within weeks of the first walls being finished. That is close to what happens on a whale skeleton during the enrichment stage, an entire miniature neighborhood forming around a structure that used to be part of a living animal. Some of the amphipods swarming the bones grow to a size that would surprise anyone used to seeing their tiny cousins in a tide pool, reaching lengths of several inches as they gorge on the unusually rich food supply. Predators start noticing too. Small fish that rarely venture near ordinary abyssal mud begin patrolling the edges of the skeleton, picking off amphipods and worms the way songbirds might pick insects off a garden fence, drawn in by a concentration of prey they would never find anywhere else nearby. Underneath all of this visible activity, something quieter and far stranger was also taking hold. Invisible without a microscope, but ultimately more important than everything happening on the surface of the bone. Deep inside the skeleton itself, a different kind of resident had already begun setting up shop, one that would end up outlasting every scavenger, worm, and crustacean crowding the enrichment stage by decades. By the time the enrichment stage reaches its peak, a whale skeleton has essentially become a piece of real estate on the ocean floor, a structure supporting far more life per square foot than the surrounding mud ever could. Scientists studying these communities describe the transformation almost like watching a vacant lot turn into a crowded high-rise over the course of a few short years. Every part of the skeleton gets used. Cracks in the vertebrae become shelter for small worms hiding from predators. Flat sections of rib provide open ground for grazing snails. Gaps between bones fill with sediment rich in leftover nutrients, creating a kind of soil that supports its own miniature garden of microscopic life. Nothing about the structure goes to waste. This kind of layered, densely packed community is rare almost anywhere else on the open seafloor, where most surfaces are flat, featureless mud stretching in every direction. A whale skeleton breaks that monotony completely, offering complex three-dimensional structure the way a coral reef or a sunken ship might, except built entirely from the remains of a single animal rather than centuries of coral growth or human construction. Researchers have found that different species tend to claim different parts of the skeleton, almost like separate floors of the same building. Certain worms cluster specifically around the skull. Certain crustaceans prefer the dense cartilage found near the joints. This kind of specialization surprised scientists, since it suggested animals were not simply grabbing whatever space happened to be available, but actively selecting particular locations suited to their specific needs. Even the space underneath the skeleton gets put to use. As the bones settle deeper into the seafloor, pockets form where sediment mixes with decaying organic material, and entirely separate communities of burrowing worms move in below the structure, hidden from view but still connected to the same chain of nutrients flowing outward from the carcass above them. A single whale, in other words, ends up supporting life on top of the bones, inside the bones, and buried beneath them all at once. All of this activity, as impressive as it looks, still runs on a finite supply of leftover tissue and enriched sediment, resources that inevitably run thin as the years pass. Slowly, month by month, the crowd thins out. The largest, most demanding predators leave first, followed gradually by the swarms of smaller grazers that depended on them being there. Eventually, the enrichment stage tenants begin to move out entirely, following the same pattern that pushed the mobile scavengers away before them, chasing the scent of fresher meals somewhere else on the seafloor. What looks, at this point, like a building finally emptying out is really just the neighborhood changing hands, making room for a much stranger, much longer lasting set of residents about to move in. What remains behind at that point is something far stranger than an empty building. It is a skeleton still packed with an enormous hidden reserve of fuel, one that almost nobody expected to find locked inside solid bone. Whale bones are unlike the bones of almost any other animal on Earth, and that difference explains why a whale fall can outlast an ordinary carcass by decades rather than months. Human bones, and the bones of most land animals, are dense and largely solid all the way through. Whale bones are riddled with the spongy, oil-soaked structure, built originally to help these massive animals control buoyancy and store energy across long ocean migrations. That spongy structure is packed with lipids, a scientific word for fat, and a single large whale skeleton can hold thousands of pounds of oil soaked directly into the bone itself. Picture a stick of butter buried inside a kitchen sponge. Then imagine that sponge stretched to the size of a school bus. That is roughly the scale of fuel sitting quietly inside one whale's remains, invisible from the outside but enormous once you know where to look. This fat does not simply sit there doing nothing once the enrichment stage tenants have moved on. Bacteria living deep inside the bone slowly break the oil down, and this process is where the whale fall story takes its strangest turn yet. The breakdown releases hydrogen sulfide, a chemical compound that smells like rotten eggs and that most animals cannot survive breathing in any real concentration. For humans and most ocean life, hydrogen sulfide is closer to a poison than a resource. For a very specific group of deep sea bacteria, it is fuel, the exact chemical they are built to run on. These bacteria spread across and inside the bone in dense colonies once the fat begins releasing its sulfide, and the arrival marks the beginning of the whale fall's third and by far longest part. The bacteria themselves are far too small to see without powerful equipment, yet their combined effect on the skeleton is anything but small. Entire patches of bone develop a pale, almost frosted coating where colonies grow thick enough to be visible to the human eye. a texture some researchers have compared to freezer burn, spreading slowly across a piece of meat left too long in the cold. Underneath that coating, a chemical engine keeps running quietly, day after day, year after year, with no sunlight and no obvious fuel source visible from the outside. This final stage carries a name that fits perfectly: the sulfophilic stage, meaning sulfur-loving. While the mobile scavenger stage lasts only months and the enrichment stage runs a handful of years, the sulfophilic stage can continue for decades, slowly working through the fat reserves buried in the skeleton one microscopic bite at a time, like a furnace built to burn for a lifetime on a single tank of fuel rather than a season. Nobody watching the frantic scavengers in the very first hours after the whale landed could have guessed that the quiet chemical reaction now taking hold inside the bones would end up outlasting everything that came before it, by a margin measured not in months but in decades. What lives off this slow chemical burn turns out to be some of the strangest life ever documented on the ocean floor, and one resident in particular would soon become the strangest character in this entire story. In 2002, more than a decade after the first whale skeleton was discovered, researchers studying bones off the coast of California found something that looked less like an animal and more like a strange, feathery plant growing straight out of solid bone. Bright red tufts, almost like tiny flowers, sprouted from cracks and crevices across the skeleton, waving gently in the current the way seaweed sways in a tide pool. These turned out to be worms, and they were unlike anything scientists had catalogued before. Researchers named them Osedax, a word built from Latin roots meaning bone eater, and the name fits with almost uncomfortable precision. These worms have no mouth, they have no stomach, they have no obvious way to eat anything at all. And yet they were found living almost exclusively on and inside solid whale bone, digging root-like structures directly into the skeleton itself, as if the bone were soil and the worm were a plant reaching down into it. At first, this made no biological sense. Every animal needs a way to take in food, whether that means a mouth, a gut, or some other system for processing nutrients. Osedax appear to have skipped that requirement entirely, thriving in large numbers on a food source that, by every normal rule of biology, it should have had no way to access. Researchers dissecting the worms found the missing piece almost immediately, once they looked closely enough. Where a stomach should have been, they found root-like tissue instead, branching downward into the bone like the roots of a tree spreading through cracked pavement. Under a microscope, that tissue was packed with something unexpected: dense colonies of bacteria living inside the worm's own body, doing a job the worm itself had no equipment to perform. Picture a plant with roots that dissolve rock instead of soil, feeding nutrients up into a flower that never once needs to open its mouth to eat. That comparison captures how Osedax survives, tapping directly into a fuel source almost no other animal on the ocean floor can reach in quite the same way, using biology borrowed entirely from a partner species living inside its own flesh. This kind of partnership, one organism handling digestion for another in exchange for shelter, is not entirely unheard of in nature, but rarely does it show up in such an extreme, specialized form. Osedax essentially rented out its entire survival strategy to a microscopic tenant, trading independence for access to a food source almost nothing else in the ocean could touch. The discovery caused a stir far beyond the small community of deep-sea biologists who first found it. News outlets picked up the story of a boneless, mouthless, gutless worm thriving on the skeletons of the largest animals on Earth, and researchers soon gave it a nickname that would end up sticking far more firmly than its official scientific name ever did. Since that first discovery, researchers have identified more than 20 separate Osedax species, each one slightly different in color, size, or preferred depth. but every single one built around the exact same trick of borrowing another organism's digestion instead of growing one of its own. Some species prefer shallower, cooler water. Others show up almost exclusively on the deepest, coldest skeletons researchers have ever found. Wherever whale bone settles on the ocean floor, it seems, some version of this strange worm eventually finds a way to arrive. The nickname arrived almost immediately after Osedax became public knowledge, and it spread faster than most scientific terms ever do. Researchers and journalists alike started calling it the zombie worm, a name that captures something true about the creature's entire existence far better than its formal Latin name ever could. Zombies in old stories rise from the dead and feed on flesh that should have stopped nourishing anything long ago. Osedax does something remarkably similar, appearing in large numbers only after a whale skeleton has already been picked clean of muscle and fat by every other scavenger on the seafloor. It thrives specifically on bone that the rest of the ecosystem has already written off as used up, extracting a final round of nutrition from material every other creature has already abandoned. The comparison goes even deeper once you consider how the worm actually feeds. It secretes acid from its root-like tissue, slowly dissolving the mineral structure of the bone itself to reach the collagen and fat trapped inside. Watching this process under a microscope, researchers describe bone visibly eroding away wherever a worm's roots made contact, a slow, silent dissolving that looks uncomfortably close to something out of a horror film played back in extreme slow motion. Osedax does not stop at whalebone either, though whale skeletons remain its most common home. Researchers have since found related species living on the bones of other large marine animals, including fish and even, in a few documented cases, cow bones deliberately placed on the seafloor as part of controlled experiments. Wherever a large mass of buried bone shows up on the ocean floor, Osedax or one of its relatives seems capable of finding it and moving in, a level of reach that surprised researchers who had originally assumed the worm was a rare specialist tied exclusively to whale remains. That adaptability raises an interesting question about how the worm actually finds skeletons scattered so far apart across such a vast ocean. Osedax begins life as a microscopic larva drifting through open water, completely blind and with no way to see a bone from a distance. Finding one skeleton among millions of square miles of empty seafloor should be close to impossible for a creature with no eyes and barely any ability to steer itself through the current. Somehow, generation after generation, enough larvae find their way onto enough skeletons to keep the species going. A single female Osedax can release staggering numbers of eggs over her lifetime, playing a numbers game where only a tiny fraction of offspring ever need to succeed for the population to survive. Most of those drifting larvae will never find a skeleton at all, dying quietly somewhere in the open water long before reaching bone. The few that do succeed carry an entire population's future with them. The explanation for how any of them manage it turns out to be almost as strange as the worm's missing mouth, hidden away inside a detail about Osedax biology that took scientists completely by surprise. Every red, feathery Osedax worm visible on a whale skeleton is female, and for a while, that fact left scientists with an obvious puzzle. If every worm anyone could actually see was female, where exactly were the males hiding? The answer turned out to be almost unbelievable. Inside each female worm's body lived dozens, sometimes hundreds, of microscopic males, so small they barely qualify as visible without a powerful microscope. These males never grow up in any traditional sense of the word. They stay tiny for their entire lives, existing almost entirely to produce sperm, tucked safely inside the body of a much larger female who provides everything they could possibly need to survive. This is one of the most extreme examples of size difference between males and females found anywhere in the entire animal kingdom. Imagine if every human man on Earth stood smaller than a single eyelash and spent his whole life living inside a woman's body, entirely dependent on her for food and shelter. That is roughly the scale of difference between male and female Osedax worms, a gap that dwarfs almost every other example biologists have ever documented in nature. Researchers first suspected something like this might be happening after noticing that every dissected female carried tiny, unidentified tissue clusters inside her body, structures that made little sense until closer examination revealed they were fully formed, if microscopic, adult males. Scientists believe this strange arrangement evolved because of how rare and scattered whale falls actually are across the vast ocean floor. A young Osedax larva drifting through open water has almost no realistic chance of finding another skeleton, let alone finding one that already has worms of the opposite sex living on it. By staying microscopic and moving directly into a female's body the instant they find one, males guarantee they never miss their only chance at reproduction, no matter how isolated that single skeleton happens to be. This detail connects to something much larger than one unusual worm species. It hints at just how rare, precious and scattered these bone islands really are across the enormous darkness of the ocean floor. A whale carcass might be the only solid, sulfide-rich surface for dozens of miles in every direction, a tiny oasis surrounded by an enormous chemical desert stretching further than any human eye will ever see in a single glance. Some researchers studying this reproductive strategy compare it to a lifeboat system built for the worst possible scenario, rather than risk sending large numbers of full-grown males out into open water searching for mates. Evolution effectively shrank the male down to almost nothing, and taught him to stow away inside the very first female he happens to encounter, guaranteeing survival even under the most desperate odds a species could face. That scarcity raises a fascinating possibility that deep-sea scientists have spent years investigating in detail. If Osedax larvae can somehow travel between isolated whale skeletons scattered across the seafloor, could other, much larger creatures use these same bone islands as stepping stones too, hopping from one temporary chemical oasis to the next across distances that would otherwise be completely impossible to cross alone? Almost every food chain most people learn about in school starts in the same place: sunlight. Plants use it to grow, animals eat the plants, other animals eat those animals, and the chain continues link by link. On the deep seafloor around a whale fall, sunlight plays no role at all. The nearest sunbeam sits thousands of feet away, and it stopped mattering to this ecosystem the moment the whale sank below the reach of light. Instead, the bacteria living inside whale bones run on a completely different kind of engine, one scientists call chemosynthesis. Where plants use light to build energy, these bacteria use chemistry, specifically the hydrogen sulfide leaking steadily out of the decomposing bone. Inside the tiny cells, the bacteria combine that sulfide with oxygen dissolved in the surrounding seawater, and the reaction produces the exact energy they need to live, grow, and multiply. Think of it like two very different kinds of batteries sitting side by side. A plant charges itself using light captured from the sun, converting it into stored energy through photosynthesis. These bacteria charge themselves using a chemical reaction pulled straight from rotting bone. No sunlight required anywhere in the process. No daylight ever reaching the reaction at all. It sounds almost impossible, an entire miniature ecosystem thriving in total blackness, running purely on chemistry instead of light, yet it happens constantly across scattered patches of the deep ocean floor. These bacteria do not simply float around loose on their own. Many of them form close partnerships with animals living directly on the skeleton, moving inside their bodies and providing energy in exchange for a safe, protected home, a relationship biologists call symbiosis. This kind of partnership shows up again and again throughout the whalefall story, and it turns out to be the exact secret behind the strangest animal living anywhere on the bones. Scientists already knew that chemosynthesis powered life around hydrothermal vents, the scalding cracks in the seafloor where mineral-rich water blasts out from deep inside the earth. Finding the exact same kind of chemistry at work on a dead whale, far from any volcanic vent, was the detail that convinced Craig Smith's team they had found something genuinely new. A whale fall was not simply a meal, it functioned as its own miniature version of a hydrothermal vent, built entirely out of a single animal's remains rather than volcanic rock. Both environments run on the same basic chemical rulebook: sulfide in, energy out, life built from a reaction rather than a ray of light. The only real difference is the source. One pulls its chemistry from magma deep inside the planet, the other pulls it from fat stored inside the bones of an animal that was, until recently, swimming somewhere in the open ocean above, breathing air and raising young the way its ancestors had for millions of years before it. That connection between whale bones and volcanic vents raised an enormous question that would take scientists years to even begin answering properly. In the summer of 1987, a small research submarine named Alvin was gliding across the Santa Catalina Basin, a stretch of deep seafloor off the coast of Southern California. The mission that day was routine, the kind of survey work that rarely makes headlines. Mapping terrain across a seafloor everyone assumed was mostly barren mud, stretching in every direction without much of interest hiding underneath it. Then, on the very last dive of the trip, the onboard sonar picked up something odd. A shape sat on the bottom that was far too large and far too solid to be a normal rock formation, too regular in outline to be a natural ridge or boulder field. The pilot steered Alvin lower, easing the submarine down through water that had not seen sunlight in longer than anyone on board could reasonably guess. Inside the cramped submersible, the crew watched their instruments closely, trying to make sense of a signal that did not match anything in their experience. Deep sea mapping produces plenty of strange readings, most of which turn out to be nothing more interesting than an unusual rock or a patch of harder sediment. This reading felt different, sharper somehow, with edges too clean to belong to ordinary geology. As Alvin's headlights cut through the blackness, the crew braced for another disappointing rock formation, another few minutes spent confirming a false alarm before moving on to finish the survey and head back toward the surface. Countless dives before this one had ended exactly that way, promising sonar readings resolving into nothing more than ordinary seafloor geology once the lights finally caught up to the signal. The submersible descended a little further, engines humming quietly against the crushing weight of water pressing in from every direction. Inside the cramped sphere of the crew compartment, barely large enough for a few people to sit shoulder to shoulder, nobody spoke much. Years of training had taught this crew to stay calm through hundreds of readings just like this one, most of which turned out to mean nothing at all. Nobody expected what the lights actually revealed. Word of the sighting would not reach the wider scientific community for weeks, buried at first inside routine expedition notes and a stack of videotapes waiting to be reviewed back on land. Nobody logging the dive that day used dramatic language to describe what the sonar had caught. The note simply mentioned an unusual return worth a second look once the footage could be properly examined on shore, a modest description for what would eventually become one of the most cited discoveries in the history of deep-sea biology. Whatever sat on that seafloor, whatever had triggered such an unusual reading, was about to become one of the most important accidental discoveries in the history of ocean science. And the crew inside Alvin that day had no idea they were about to see it first. What appeared out of the darkness stopped the Alvin crew cold. A skeleton, roughly 65 feet long, lay half buried in the sediment, 1,240 feet below the surface. It looked ancient, almost architectural, ribs curving upward from the mud like the frame of some sunken cathedral nobody had ever been meant to find. Reviewing the video footage afterward, oceanographer Craig Smith identified the remains as either a blue whale or a fin whale, one of the two largest animals ever to exist on this planet. On its own, that identification would already have counted as a genuinely remarkable find. Whale skeletons resting on the open seafloor are rarely spotted at all, since most bodies sink far from human eyes and stay hidden there for good. forgotten by everyone except the animals that eventually find them. What made this particular discovery extraordinary was not the skeleton itself, it was everything living on top of it. The bones were nothing like a clean, bare museum display. They were covered edge to edge in a churning mass of life. Worms wriggled through cracks running along the vertebrae. Small clams and mussels clustered in thick colonies along the exposed ribs. Snails and limpets crawled slowly across flat sections of bone. Pale mats of bacteria coated entire stretches of the skeleton like frost spreading across a window on a cold morning. For several long minutes, nobody inside the submersible said much of anything, too busy staring through the viewport at a scene none of them had a ready explanation for. Deep-sea researchers see plenty of strange sights during a career of dives like this one, but nothing quite prepared this particular crew for a skeleton this size, wrapped this thoroughly in living tissue that clearly had no business thriving this far from sunlight. This did not look like ordinary deep-sea life to anyone on the crew. Smith and his colleagues recognized some of these creatures from a very different, very unexpected place entirely. The scalding hydrothermal vents found near volcanic cracks in the seafloor, locations often thousands of miles away from where this whale had settled. Finding vent-like animals thriving around a dead whale, far from any volcano, made no obvious sense based on anything scientists understood about the deep sea at the time. Smith's team had stumbled onto something nobody had properly studied before, a completely new kind of deep-sea ecosystem hiding in plain sight on a seafloor everyone had assumed held nothing worth stopping for. Later dives to the same location would bring better cameras, more careful sampling equipment, and a growing list of questions nobody on that first dive had thought to ask, since nobody expected to need answers to questions about an ecosystem science did not yet know existed. It would take years of careful follow-up research to understand exactly what they were looking at, and what they eventually found would end up rewriting the timeline of how long a single death can support life in total darkness. When Craig Smith's team first published their findings about the Santa Catalina skeleton, the reaction from much of the scientific community was cautious skepticism rather than immediate excitement. A single dead whale supporting an entire chemosynthetic ecosystem sounded, to many researchers reading the paper for the first time, closer to a fluke than a genuine, repeatable phenomenon worth building a whole new field of study around. Some of that skepticism was reasonable. Deep-sea research in the 1980s relied on expensive submersible dives, limited funding, and a scientific culture that had spent decades treating the abyssal plane as fundamentally uneventful. A claim this dramatic needed more than one lucky sighting to convince skeptical colleagues that whale falls represented something worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as an unusual, one-time coincidence. Part of the resistance also came down to simple funding realities. Submersible time is enormously expensive, and research budgets in the 1980s were already stretched thin across countless competing priorities. Convincing review boards to fund follow-up expeditions built around a single, unverified sighting required more than enthusiasm. It required a case solid enough to justify pulling resources away from other, more established lines of research. Smith's team responded the only way good scientists can, by gathering more evidence. They returned to the original skeleton repeatedly over the following years, documenting how the community of animals living on the bones changed over time. They also began deliberately searching for other whale falls, both natural discoveries and carcasses sunk on purpose, building a growing body of evidence that the Santa Catalina skeleton was not a fluke at all. By the mid-1990s, additional whale falls had been documented in other locations, each one showing the same basic pattern of scavengers, then swarms of smaller invertebrates, then sulfur-loving bacteria settling in for a decades-long stay. The skepticism that had greeted the original discovery slowly gave way to genuine excitement, and whalefall research grew from a strange footnote into a recognized field of its own, within deep sea biology, complete with dedicated conferences, funded research programs, and a growing list of scientists eager to study it. This pattern, doubt followed by mounting evidence followed by acceptance, shows up constantly throughout the history of ocean science. The deep sea has surprised researchers again and again over the decades, revealing ecosystems and behaviors nobody had predicted simply because so little of it has ever actually been explored directly. Whale Falls joined a growing list of deep ocean discoveries that initially sounded almost too strange to be real. What nobody could have predicted, not even Smith himself, was just how much bigger this story would eventually become. Decades after that first skeptical reception, researchers working near a very different coastline were about to find evidence suggesting whale falls might be far more common than anyone in 1987 had dared to imagine. Hydrothermal vents are among the most extreme environments found anywhere on the planet. Cracks in the ocean floor where mineral-rich water blasts out at scalding temperatures, sometimes exceeding 600 degrees, fueling their own chemosynthetic ecosystems built on bacteria much like the ones living on whale bones. Vents were first discovered in the late 1970s, and their existence alone had already forced scientists to rethink what kinds of life the deep ocean could support. Before that discovery, most researchers assumed life at these depths depended entirely, without exception, on food drifting down from the sunlit surface far above. Vents proved that assumption wrong in dramatic fashion, revealing thriving communities that had never needed sunlight at all. That earlier discovery gave Craig Smith's team an immediate reference point the moment they spotted unfamiliar creatures clustered on the Santa Catalina skeleton. Without the hydrothermal vent discovery only a decade earlier, the strange animals covering the whale bones might have seemed even more inexplicable than they already did. The similarities between vent ecosystems and whale falls go far beyond a shared reliance on chemistry instead of sunlight. Both environments host tube worms, certain species of clams, and dense colonies of sulfur-loving bacteria. Both create small, temporary islands of abundance surrounded by comparatively empty seafloor. Both support animals capable of surviving in water chemistry that would kill almost anything else in the ocean. The differences matter just as much as the similarities. A hydrothermal vent can remain active for centuries, continuously fed by heat and chemicals rising from deep inside the Earth's crust. A whale fall runs on a strictly limited fuel supply, the fat stored inside one animal's bones, and once that fuel runs out after several decades, the sulfophilic stage ends for good and the skeleton eventually crumbles into ordinary seafloor sediment. Picture a campfire compared to a volcano. The volcano can keep erupting for as long as the planet keeps producing heat underneath it, essentially without an expiration date. The campfire burns brightly for a while, providing real warmth and light, but it eventually goes out once the wood runs out, no matter how carefully it was built. A whale fall works like the campfire, intense and genuinely valuable while it lasts, but fundamentally temporary in a way a hydrothermal vent is not. Despite this key difference, genetic studies comparing species found at both types of locations have revealed striking overlap. Close relatives of the same worms, the same clams, and the same bacteria showing up at vent sites and whale skeletons separated by enormous distances. That overlap raised an obvious and fascinating question among researchers studying both ecosystems side by side. If whale falls and hydrothermal vents share so many of the same specialized residents, and if those residents cannot survive long journeys through ordinary chemical-poor seafloor, how exactly do their offspring manage to travel between two types of habitats scattered so far apart across the vast, empty stretches of open ocean? Many vent species, tube worms, certain clams, specific types of bacteria, show up at hydrothermal vent sites separated by hundreds or even thousands of miles of ordinary, food-poor seafloor. For years, this pattern puzzled deep-sea biologists, since the tiny drifting larvae these species produce did not seem capable of surviving a journey that long without any food source along the way. Craig Smith proposed an idea that reshaped how scientists thought about the entire problem. What if whale falls acted as stepping stones, temporary chemical islands scattered across the seafloor that vent-adapted species could use as rest stops during their journey between permanent vent sites, refueling along a route that would otherwise offer nothing at all to sustain them? A dead whale, with its own sulfide-rich chemistry mimicking a hydrothermal vent, could theoretically support vent-adapted species for the decades it takes their larvae to eventually drift onward and find the next vent. Rather than crossing an empty ocean in one impossible, unbroken journey, these species could hop from whale fall to vent, spreading their population gradually across distances that would otherwise be far too vast to cross. Each stop along the way would only need to last a matter of years, not decades, to give a new generation of larvae enough time to grow, reproduce, and launch the next leg of the journey outward into open water. Picture the deep ocean as an enormous, mostly empty parking lot, with hydrothermal vents as rare charging stations spaced impossibly far apart from each other. A whale fall works like a temporary charging station too, one that appears without warning, lasts for decades, then eventually disappears once the last of the bone chemistry runs dry. For a creature trying to cross that parking lot, stopping to recharge partway through the journey could make the difference between reaching the other side and never making it at all. Genetic studies have since found real overlap between species living on whale falls and species living at hydrothermal vents, supporting the idea that these two types of ecosystems are connected in ways scientists once thought impossible to prove. The stepping stone idea remains an active area of research, with not every detail fully settled, but the evidence gathered so far paints whale falls as far more important to the wider ocean than a single dead animal might otherwise suggest. If whale falls really do connect vent ecosystems across thousands of miles of empty seafloor, then every whale that dies and sinks becomes something much bigger than a meal for scavengers. It becomes a bridge, a temporary piece of infrastructure holding together an entire hidden network of deep sea life that most people walking along a beach will never know exist beneath the waves. A network stretching across ocean basins most maps do not even bother to name. As researchers kept returning to whale skeletons across multiple ocean basins throughout the 1990s and 2000s, a striking pattern emerged from the data. Certain species showed up again and again on whale bones and almost nowhere else on the planet. These were not simply opportunistic deep-sea animals enjoying an easy meal. Many of them appeared to be specialists, evolved specifically to exploit the unique chemistry only a decomposing whale skeleton can provide. Osedax worms lead this list by a wide margin, with more than 20 distinct species identified so far, each one apparently specialized for slightly different conditions of depth, temperature, or bone chemistry. Certain species of clams and mussels found thriving during the sulfophilic stage have also been documented nowhere else on Earth, along with specific types of limpets, snails, and even a few species of shrimp that seem built for this exact environment and nothing else. This pattern matters enormously to biologists studying how life adapts to extreme, narrow environments. A species that can only survive on rotting whalebone represents an entire evolutionary path shaped by an incredibly rare set of conditions that might only occur in scattered pockets across the deep ocean at any given moment in time, pockets separated from each other by hundreds of miles of seafloor, offering nothing remotely similar in between. It also raises a sobering question that connects directly back to human history. If entire species depend on whale falls to survive, what happens to those species when the number of whales in the ocean drops sharply? For roughly 2 centuries, industrial whaling did exactly that, hunting several great whale species down to a small fraction of their original population, before international protections finally slowed the decline in the middle of the 20th century. Fewer whales in the ocean inevitably means fewer whale falls reaching the seafloor, and fewer whale falls means fewer chemical oases for these specialized bone-dependent species to find. Some scientists believe certain whale fall specialists may have already gone extinct during the height of industrial whaling, vanishing before anyone even knew they existed, victims of a food source disappearing from an ecosystem most people never even knew was there in the first place. This connection between whale populations on the surface and hidden ecosystems on the seafloor, thousands of feet below, turns the story of a single dead whale into something with real consequences for the entire ocean. Consequences that stretch across centuries and connect decisions made near the surface directly to biodiversity buried thousands of feet below. That connection deserves a closer look later in this story, but first, the whale fall story has one more scientific mystery to work through. Exactly how long can a single skeleton actually keep feeding the deep before its chemistry finally runs dry for good? Answering this question required something deep sea science rarely gets the luxury of doing: watching the same location patiently, year after year, without rushing to a conclusion. Craig Smith's team committed to exactly that kind of long-term study, returning to the Santa Catalina skeleton again and again across more than a decade, tracking every visible change in the community living on its bones. Each visit revealed a slightly different snapshot. Early trips still caught traces of the enrichment stage lingering in a few spots, small pockets of amphipods and worms finishing off the last scraps of readily available tissue. Later visits found the community shifting almost entirely towards sulfur-loving bacteria and the specialized animals that depend on them, a signal that the skeleton had settled fully into its long, slow final chapter. Estimating exactly how long that final chapter could last required more than simple observation. Researchers needed to understand how much fat actually remained locked inside a whale skeleton of this size, and how quickly sulfate-reducing bacteria could realistically work through a reserve that large. By combining direct observation with laboratory measurements of bone density and lipid content, Smith's team built a model estimating just how far this particular fuel supply could stretch. The numbers were staggering. A skeleton belonging to one of the largest whale species could theoretically support active chemosynthetic life for decades, not years, an estimate far beyond anything researchers had originally expected when they first spotted the skeleton back in 1987. What looked at first glance like a single unfortunate death sitting quietly on the mud turned out to be closer to a long-term power plant, quietly generating chemical energy for far longer than most people would guess a dead animal could sustain anything at all. Comparing this to almost any other food source in the ocean makes the scale even clearer. A school of fish might feed local predators for hours. A dead squid might feed scavengers for days. A whale skeleton, running on fat reserves hidden deep inside its own bones, was shaping up to feed an entire specialized community for a length of time closer to a human lifetime than a single meal. Researchers double-checked the model against every other documented whale fall they could find data for, and the pattern held remarkably steady across different sites and species. Larger whales with denser, oil-rich skeletons consistently supported longer sulfophilic stages than smaller whales, confirming that size truly was one of the biggest factors driving how long any single skeleton could keep the lights on for its own miniature ecosystem. That estimate alone would have been remarkable enough on its own. What made it truly extraordinary was watching it actually play out in real time, on the very same skeleton where this whole story first began. Over a length of time, nobody studying the ocean floor had ever managed to track this closely before. By 2002, 15 years after Alvin's crew first spotted the Santa Catalina skeleton, the sulfophilic bacteria living on its bones were still thriving, still breaking down fat reserves buried deep inside the structure, still supporting a dense community of specialized animals built entirely around that slow chemical burn. Most short-term feeding events in the ocean finish within days or weeks. This one had been running continuously for a decade and a half without any real sign of slowing down. Based on how much fat remained locked inside large whale bones and how slowly sulfophilic bacteria consumed it, Smith's research team eventually calculated that a skeleton this size could plausibly support active chemosynthetic life for as long as 50 years, an estimate that stunned much of the scientific community when it was first published. A single animal, dead and resting quietly on the ocean floor, capable of fueling an entire ecosystem for half a century. To put that number in perspective, imagine planting a single apple tree and having it continue producing fresh fruit every single day for 50 straight years without any watering, feeding, or outside care whatsoever. That is roughly the kind of sustained output researchers were describing, except instead of apples, the whale skeleton was producing a steady supply of chemical energy that an entire community of specialized deep-sea creatures had learned to depend on completely. This discovery reshaped how scientists thought about the deep ocean floor as a whole. It had always been assumed to be one of the most food-starved, event-poor environments on the planet, a place where nothing dramatic happens for centuries at a time between rare deliveries of food from far above. A single whale carcass, it turned out, could function as a decades-long hotspot of biological activity, rivaling far more famous ecosystems in terms of how long it could sustain dense, specialized life on almost no outside input at all. Other research groups studying separate whale falls around the world began reporting similar longevity in their own sites, lending further weight to the 50-year estimate rather than treating the Santa Catalina skeleton as some kind of unusual outlier. A pattern that once rested on a single, closely watched example was quickly becoming a genuine, repeatable feature of how whale falls function almost everywhere researchers had thought to look for it. The Santa Catalina skeleton, sitting quietly in the dark since before most people reading this were even born, had become one of the most studied objects in all of deep-sea biology, a single point on the map that researchers kept returning to decade after decade. It would not stay the most famous whale skeleton on Earth for very much longer. Off the coast of a city more famous for movie studios than marine science, researchers were about to stumble onto something that would make one lucky discovery look almost small by comparison. Not every whale skeleton lasting through the sulfophilic stage sticks around for the same length of time, and figuring out why required researchers to compare dozens of documented whale falls against each other, looking for patterns hidden in the differences between them. Several factors turned out to matter enormously, starting with something as simple as the size of the whale itself. A blue whale, the largest animal to ever exist on this planet, carries a skeleton absolutely packed with oil-rich bone, far more raw fuel than a smaller species could ever store. A minke whale, considerably smaller, simply has less bone mass and less stored fat to work with, meaning its skeleton runs through the sulfophilic stage noticeably faster than a blue whale's remains would in the exact same conditions. Bigger animal, bigger fuel tank, longer lasting ecosystem. Depth plays a major role as well. Colder water found at greater depths slows down bacterial activity across the board, meaning skeletons resting in the deepest, coldest parts of the ocean tend to break down more slowly than skeletons settling in relatively shallower, warmer water closer to the surface. A skeleton at 10,000 feet might outlast an identical skeleton sitting at only 2,000 feet by a considerable margin, simply because the cold slows every chemical process involved. Local water chemistry matters too, particularly the amount of oxygen dissolved in the surrounding seawater. Since much of the bone breakdown process depends on bacteria that need at least some oxygen to function efficiently, skeletons resting in especially low oxygen pockets of the ocean tend to decompose far more slowly than skeletons sitting in normal, oxygen-rich water nearby. Ocean currents play a quieter but still meaningful role as well. A A skeleton sitting in a location with strong, steady currents tends to lose sulfide into the surrounding water faster than one resting somewhere calm and still, since moving water carries the chemical away before nearby bacteria have as much chance to make use of it. Slower, more sheltered locations tend to trap that chemistry closer to the bone, giving local bacteria more time to feed and multiply before the sulfide simply drifts off elsewhere. Consider two nearly identical whale skeletons, same species, same size, same age at death. Drop one into a warm, shallow, oxygen-rich bay, and drop the other into a cold, deep, oxygen-starved basin. Within a few decades, the first skeleton might already be crumbling into ordinary sediment, its fuel supply exhausted, and its community of specialized animals long since moved on. The second skeleton, protected by cold and starved oxygen, could still be actively supporting a thriving, sulfophilic community, essentially frozen in an earlier stage of its own decomposition. This exact combination of factors, low oxygen water trapped in a deep sheltered basin, turned out to describe one particular stretch of seafloor almost perfectly, a location researchers were about to study far more closely than anyone could have anticipated. Understanding why certain locations preserve whale skeletons unusually well requires looking closely at the water itself and specifically at something missing from it entirely. Certain deep ocean basins sit in bowl-shaped depressions on the seafloor, walled in on all sides by underwater ridges called sills that physically block normal ocean currents from flushing the deep water in and out on any regular schedule. Trapped behind these sills, the water pooling at the bottom of the basin barely mixes with fresher, oxygen-rich water circulating elsewhere in the ocean. Over time, oxygen levels in this trapped water drop far lower than in most other parts of the deep sea, creating what scientists call an oxygen minimum zone. For most animals, water this starved of oxygen is close to uninhabitable, a dead zone few creatures can tolerate for long. For a sunken whale skeleton, low oxygen turns out to be a remarkably effective form of natural preservation. Many of the bacteria and small scavengers responsible for breaking down bone over time need oxygen to do their work efficiently. Starve the water of oxygen, and that breakdown process slows dramatically, allowing skeletons to remain largely intact for far longer than they would in normal, oxygen-rich seawater sitting just a short distance away. Picture leaving a piece of fruit out on a kitchen counter compared to sealing that same piece of fruit inside a vacuum bag with most of the air removed. The fruit in the vacuum bag lasts dramatically longer, not because nothing wants to break it down, but because the natural process that would normally do the breaking down has been slowed nearly to a crawl. Certain deep ocean basins function almost like nature's own vacuum bag, wrapped protectively around whatever happens to sink into them. This same low oxygen environment, oddly enough, appears to affect which specialized bone-eating species actually show up on skeletons resting there. When researchers examined several deeply preserved skeletons using underwater robots in recent years, they found something unexpected in a few locations. No Osedax worms at all. The bone-eating zombie worms that typically dominate this stage of decomposition almost everywhere else, scientists have looked around the world. Scientists are still investigating exactly why the zombie worms appear to be missing from certain low-oxygen graveyards, whether it relates to the oxygen levels themselves, water temperature, or some other factor unique to these particular basins. Some researchers suspect the worms may simply need slightly more oxygen than these extreme basins provide to power the acid-producing process they rely on to dissolve bone, though this remains an open question awaiting further study. Whatever the final answer turns out to be, it adds yet another layer of mystery to a discovery that was about to reshape how scientists think about how common whale falls really are across the entire ocean floor. For decades after the 1987 discovery, natural whale falls remained one of the rarest finds in all of ocean science. Spotting one required an enormous amount of luck since the deep seafloor is vast, dark, and almost entirely unexplored, and a sunken whale is a remarkably tiny target hidden somewhere within millions of square miles of open mud. By the early 2020s, scientists worldwide had documented only a small handful of natural whale falls in total, each one treated as a rare and genuinely valuable scientific event worth years of dedicated study. Then, in 2021, researchers from Scripps Institution of Oceanography set out on a mission that had nothing to do with whales at all. Oceanographers Eric Terrell and Sophia Merrifield were investigating industrial waste dumped on the seafloor off the coast of Los Angeles, in an area called the San Pedro Basin, roughly 15 miles offshore between Catalina Island and the mainland. Decades earlier, this stretch of seafloor had served as an industrial dumping ground, and the team simply wanted to map exactly what was still sitting down there. Nobody involved in planning the survey expected whale skeletons to factor into the results at all. The goal was straightforward environmental assessment, cataloging decades-old waste using modern sonar technology far more precise than anything available when the original dumping took place. As the survey progressed across a stretch of ocean floor roughly the size of Washington, D.C., the sonar data began painting a picture nobody on the team had anticipated seeing. Curved shapes repeating themselves across the readout in patterns that looked nothing like the barrels the team had actually set out to find. Scattered among barrel after barrel of dumped industrial waste, distinct shapes began appearing that did not match anything related to human dumping activity at all. Long, curved, oddly regular outlines showed up again and again across the survey data, shapes that looked, to a trained eye, remarkably similar to something else entirely, something none of the researchers had specifically been looking for when the expedition first set out to sea. Whale skeletons. Not one, not a handful. The early data suggested dozens of them, scattered across the basin floor in numbers nobody studying whale falls had ever documented in a single location before, hiding in plain sight just off the coast of one of the largest cities in the United States. A stretch of water millions of people drive past every single day without any idea what rests beneath the waves. The team's first reaction, according to those involved, was disbelief rather than excitement. Sonar shapes can be deceiving, and researchers experienced enough to know better than to announce a discovery this significant based on early, unconfirmed data alone. Before anyone was willing to call this a graveyard, the shapes on the screen needed to be seen directly, photographed up close, and confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt. Confirming what the initial sonar data seemed to suggest required a second, far more detailed survey. In 2023, Terrell and Merrifield returned to the San Pedro Basin with more advanced equipment, determined to figure out exactly what their team had stumbled onto 2 years earlier and whether the strange shapes really were what everyone suspected them to be. Using autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with high-resolution cameras, the team began methodically photographing and mapping each of the unusual shapes identified in the earlier survey. One by one, the images confirmed what the sonar had hinted at: curved ribs, long vertebral columns, skulls resting at odd angles in the sediment. These were unmistakably whale skeletons, and there were far more of them than anyone had initially dared to assume. The scale of the survey itself deserves attention on its own. Mapping a stretch of seafloor roughly 350 square kilometers in size, an area more than twice the size of Washington, D.C., at this level of detail represented one of the most ambitious high-resolution surveys of its kind ever attempted. Most previous whale fall discoveries had come from small, targeted dives covering a tiny fraction of that area. This survey covered an enormous stretch of ocean floor systematically, leaving very little room for anything large to hide undetected, sweeping the same patch of seafloor repeatedly until the imagery left almost no reasonable doubt about what the cameras were showing. That thoroughness is likely part of the explanation for why this particular survey found so many skeletons compared to every previous search combined. As Craig Smith himself noted when commenting on the discovery, this level of detailed coverage across an area this size had simply never been attempted before anywhere in the world. Finding dozens of whale skeletons might say less about the San Pedro Basin being uniquely special and more about how rarely anyone had ever actually looked this carefully at any comparable stretch of seafloor. That possibility carries enormous implications far beyond this one basin off the coast of California. If a survey this thorough uncovered this many skeletons in one location, similar concentrations could plausibly be hiding, completely undiscovered, in ocean basins scattered across the entire planet, simply waiting for someone with the right equipment and enough patience to look closely enough to finally find them. Marine agencies around the world took notice of the methodology as much as the discovery itself, since the survey demonstrated that modern sonar technology, paired with autonomous vehicles capable of covering vast distances without constant human piloting, could realistically map stretches of seafloor at a scale and level of detail that would have taken entire research careers to achieve using the submersible-based methods common in the 1980s and 1990s. By the time the follow-up surveys wrapped up in 2023, Terrell and Merrifield's team had documented at least 6 whale falls in close, confirmed detail, with sonar data suggesting the true number scattered across the wider basin could realistically be 60 or more. To understand just how enormous that number really is, consider that scientists worldwide had found only around 50 confirmed natural whale falls total since 1977, across every single ocean on the planet combined. Read that comparison again, slowly. One patch of seafloor near Los Angeles appeared to hold more whale skeletons than the rest of the world's oceans combined, gathered from decades of dedicated, careful searching by research teams working across dozens of different countries. A discovery made almost by accident during a survey originally focused entirely on industrial waste had potentially doubled or even tripled the total known population of documented whale falls on Earth in a single research expedition, a statistic that took even veteran whale fall researchers by surprise when it was first announced. News of the discovery spread quickly through the scientific community, generating the kind of excitement whale fall research had not experienced since the original 1987 find. Researchers who had spent entire careers studying a mere handful of documented skeletons suddenly had access to a location holding potentially dozens of specimens clustered together, offering an unprecedented opportunity to compare whale falls of different ages, sizes, and species side by side in a single, relatively accessible location, something no research program anywhere in the world had ever been able to attempt before. Questions immediately followed the excitement. Why were so many whale skeletons concentrated in this one particular basin? Had something unusual caused an unusually large number of whales to die in this exact area over the years? Or did the basin simply preserve skeletons unusually well compared to elsewhere, collecting evidence of ordinary whale deaths that would have decomposed and vanished almost anywhere else in the ocean? NOAA Fisheries, the federal agency responsible for protecting whale populations in American waters, quickly noted that the discovery did not necessarily point toward any unusual threat to whales in the area. The skeletons could represent decades, even centuries, worth of natural deaths slowly accumulating in a basin uniquely suited to preserving them rather than evidence of any sudden or recent die-off. Untangling exactly how these skeletons ended up concentrated in one place would require years of additional research that had already begun turning up secrets far stranger than anyone expected to find buried among the bones, secrets that had nothing to do with whales at all, and everything to do with what humans themselves had been quietly leaving behind on the same stretch of seafloor for decades. The whale skeletons were never actually the original target of the Scripps survey, and the reason researchers were scanning the San Pedro Basin in the first place reveals a much darker chapter of the same story. Throughout the early to mid-20th century, this stretch of seafloor served as a dumping ground for industrial waste generated by companies operating along the Southern California coastline, a practice that continued for years before regulations finally caught up with the damage it was causing. Among the objects the sonar survey identified were barrel after barrel containing DDT, a pesticide so environmentally destructive that it was banned for most uses in the United States back in the 1970s. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of barrels containing this toxic chemical and its byproducts may be scattered across the wider basin, sitting on the seafloor for decades, slowly leaking their contents into an ecosystem nobody at the time bothered to consider. Some of the barrels photographed during the survey showed visible corrosion, raising fresh questions about how much of their contents had already escaped into the surrounding sediment over the decades since they were first dumped. Picture two very different kinds of history sitting side by side on the exact same patch of ocean floor. In one direction, ancient whale skeletons quietly building 50-year-long ecosystems through nothing but natural chemistry and patient biology. In the other direction, rusting barrels of banned poison, evidence of decades of careless industrial dumping that treated the deep ocean as a convenient place to hide problems rather than an ecosystem worth protecting. Researchers are still working to understand what effect, if any, the nearby DDT contamination might be having on the whale fall communities living just a short distance away. Whether the pesticide barrels have influenced which species colonize nearby skeletons, or whether the two sites exist essentially independently of each other, despite their close proximity, remains an open question that ongoing studies are actively working to answer. What the DDT discovery makes unmistakably clear is that the deep ocean floor, once assumed to be far too remote and far too empty to matter much to human activity, has been quietly absorbing the consequences of decisions made on land for the better part of a century. The same basin capable of preserving a beautiful, decades-long chemical ecosystem built from a whale's remains was simultaneously serving as a hidden dumping ground for one of the most notorious pesticides ever manufactured. Two entirely different legacies resting only yards apart in the same patch of permanent darkness, each one telling a very different story about humanity's relationship with the ocean floor. Before any of these discoveries could happen, whales first had to exist in large enough numbers to keep sinking regularly enough for skeletons to accumulate on the seafloor in the first place. For most of human history, that was simply the natural state of the ocean. Then, starting in earnest during the 19th century and accelerating dramatically through the 20th, industrial whaling changed that equation on a scale almost too large to properly comprehend. Modern whaling fleets, equipped with explosive harpoons and factory ships capable of processing an entire whale in a matter of hours, hunted several great whale species toward the edge of extinction over the course of just a few generations. Blue whales, the largest animals ever to exist on Earth, saw their global population fall from several 100,000 individuals before commercial whaling began down to only a few thousand by the time international protections finally arrived in the 1960s and 1970s. Other species suffered similarly devastating losses. Fin whales, humpback whales, and sperm whales were all hunted in numbers that pushed their populations down to a small fraction of what they had been only a century earlier. Some estimates suggest that industrial whaling removed more than 2 million great whales from the world's oceans over the course of the 20th century alone, a number so large it becomes difficult to picture as individual animals rather than an abstract statistic. Factory ships processed carcasses so efficiently that a single vessel could handle dozens of whales in a single voyage. turning what once took small crews weeks to accomplish into an assembly line operation capable of working through entire local populations within a handful of hunting seasons. Picture emptying a packed football stadium down to a scattered handful of people still sitting in the stands, then imagine that same collapse happening across an area covering most of the surface of the planet. That is roughly the scale of change industrial whaling forced onto the ocean's largest animals within the span of only a few human lifetimes, a transformation that happened largely out of sight, deep beneath waves most people would never think to associate with a crisis this severe. At the time, almost nobody considered what this population collapse might mean for anything beyond the whales themselves. Nobody in the whaling industry, and almost nobody in the scientific community, had any concept that these animals played a critical role in supporting entire hidden ecosystems on the ocean floor. That connection would not become clear until decades later, when scientists finally understood exactly what a dead whale actually leaves behind, long after the harpoons had gone quiet and the industry itself had largely faded into history. Understanding whale falls properly means understanding what happens when the number of whales dying and sinking drops sharply across an entire ocean basin. Fewer living whales inevitably means fewer future whale falls reaching the seafloor, and fewer whale falls means fewer chemical oases scattered across the deep ocean for specialized, bone-dependent species to find and colonize. Oases that, once lost, can take generations to reappear even after whale numbers begin climbing back toward their former levels. Scientists studying this connection believe the whaling era likely caused a dramatic decline in the total number of active whale falls sitting on ocean floors around the world at any given time, a decline that would have played out completely invisibly, thousands of feet below where anyone was paying attention. While whalers were counting the animals they killed on the surface, an entirely separate ecosystem was quietly starving somewhere in the darkness below, losing its primary food source without anyone realizing a connection even existed. Some researchers believe certain whale fall specialist species, animals adapted specifically to survive only on decomposing whale bone, may have already gone extinct during the height of industrial whaling, disappearing before scientists even developed the tools needed to study them. If true, this would mean humanity managed to wipe out entire species living in one of the most remote environments on Earth without ever even knowing those species existed in the first place. A quiet tragedy playing out far from any headline or public awareness, unfolding one silent skeleton at a time. Across ocean basins, nobody was watching closely enough to notice. Consider the stepping stone theory discussed earlier in this story. The idea that whale falls help connect hydrothermal vent ecosystems scattered across vast stretches of empty ocean. If that theory holds up under continued research, then a dramatic decline in whale falls during the whaling era may have severed connections between vent communities that had relied on those stepping stones for countless generations, potentially isolating populations that once flowed freely between distant vent sites. The full scope of this hidden damage remains difficult to measure precisely, since scientists cannot study ecosystems that vanished before anyone knew to look for them. What researchers can say with confidence is that whale falls connect directly to whale populations, and whale populations connect directly to centuries of human decisions made almost entirely without any awareness of what those decisions were costing the deep ocean floor far below, a cost nobody could see, nobody could measure, and nobody even knew to look for until long after the damage had already been done. The connection between surface whale populations and seafloor ecosystems raises an uncomfortable modern question. Even though most commercial whaling stopped decades ago, and several whale species have shown real signs of population recovery since international protections took effect, whale numbers today still sit far below where they stood before industrial whaling began in earnest. Blue whale populations, for example, remain at only a small fraction of their pre-whaling numbers despite decades of legal protection, hovering somewhere around a tenth of their original global population according to most current estimates. Fewer blue whales alive today means fewer blue whale falls reaching the seafloor compared to the centuries before whaling began, even accounting for the fact that hunting itself has mostly stopped. Scientists studying this gap point out that recovery on the surface does not automatically translate into recovery on the seafloor. Even if every whale population fully rebounded tomorrow, the deep ocean would still need decades to catch up, since the specialized animals depending on whale falls can only expand their own numbers as quickly as new skeletons actually become available to support them. This matters because whale falls are not evenly distributed gifts arriving on a predictable schedule. They depend entirely on how many whales exist, how long those whales typically live, and how frequently natural deaths occur across a population large enough to produce a steady trickle of carcasses reaching the deep ocean floor. A smaller population produces fewer deaths in total, which produces fewer whale falls, which produces fewer chemical oases scattered across the seafloor for specialized species, depending on them to survive. Think of it like a forest that lost most of its oldest, largest trees generations ago, even after loggers stop cutting and even after new trees grow back to eventually replace what was lost. An entire community of insects and fungi that depended specifically on massive, ancient deadwood might struggle to recover simply because there are not enough giant fallen trees left rotting on the forest floor to support them at the scale they once thrived at. The whale fall ecosystem faces a strikingly similar challenge, deep beneath waves rather than beneath a forest canopy. Some conservation biologists argue this hidden consequence deserves far more attention than it currently receives in public conversations about whale conservation. Most discussions about protecting whales understandably focus on the animals themselves, their intelligence, their songs, their role in ocean food chains near the surface, the story of what whales leave behind after they die, and what depends on that legacy in the permanent darkness far below, remains largely unknown outside a small community of specialized deep-sea researchers, even though the stakes for that hidden ecosystem are just as real as the stakes for the whale swimming above it. If declining whale populations genuinely reduced the number of whale falls reaching the seafloor over the past 2 centuries, an obvious and hopeful question follows naturally from that conclusion. Could ongoing whale population recovery eventually rebuild what was lost, restoring whale fall ecosystems back towards something closer to their original scale before industrial whaling began? The early signs offer some genuine reason for optimism. Humpback whale populations in several regions have rebounded dramatically since international whaling bans took effect, in some cases climbing back to numbers close to their estimated pre-whaling levels. Gray whales along the Pacific coast of North America have shown similarly strong recovery. If these trends continue across other great whale species, the total number of whales dying naturally and sinking to the seafloor each year could gradually climb back toward historical levels over the coming decades. Recovery will not happen overnight, and some species face a much steeper climb back than others. Blue whales, despite decades of protection, still recover far more slowly, partly because they reproduce infrequently and partly because ongoing threats like ship strikes and fishing gear entanglement continue killing individuals before they reach old age. A full recovery of blue whale populations, and by extension a full recovery of blue whale falls reaching the seafloor, could realistically take many more decades even under the best possible conservation conditions. Conservation groups tracking these numbers argue that every policy protecting whales today, from shipping lane adjustments to fishing gear regulations, carries consequences reaching far beyond the animals themselves, rippling outward into an ecosystem most policymakers have likely never even considered when weighing the costs and benefits of stronger protections. Scientists studying this connection have started using the phrase whale pump to describe the broader role these animals play in ocean health, referring not just to whale falls but to the way whales cycle nutrients between deep water and the sunlit surface throughout their entire lives, not only after death. Protecting and rebuilding whale populations, researchers argue, means protecting an entire chain of ecological processes that stretches from the ocean surface all the way down to ecosystems living in total darkness thousands of feet below. Every whale allowed to live out a full natural lifespan, undisturbed by hunting or preventable human threats, eventually becomes a future whale fall somewhere on the ocean floor, a future chemical oasis supporting specialized life for decades after that animal's death. In this sense, protecting whales today is not just about saving one species from extinction, it is about giving an entire hidden ecosystem, one most people will never see or even know existed, its best possible chance at rebuilding what centuries of hunting quietly took away. One skeleton, one bacterial colony, and one zombie worm at a time. Waiting for scientists to stumble across a natural whale fall by pure luck was always going to be a painfully slow way to study something this important. A handful of accidental discoveries were never going to provide enough data to fully understand how these ecosystems form, grow, and eventually fade away over the course of decades. So researchers in several countries eventually decided to stop waiting for luck entirely and start building whale falls of their own instead. Beginning in the late 1990s and continuing for decades afterward, research teams in the United States, Sweden, and Japan began deliberately sinking whale carcasses, usually animals that had already died from natural strandings or accidental ship collisions, into carefully chosen spots on the seafloor. Off the coast of Monterey, California, off the coast of Sweden, and in Sagami Bay off the coast of Japan, scientists lowered whale bodies to the bottom and then returned again and again over the following months and years to document exactly what happened at each site. This approach gave researchers something the accidental discoveries never could: a precisely known start date. With a natural whale fall like the one found in 1987, scientists had no way of knowing how long the skeleton had already been sitting there before Alvin's sonar happened to find it. With a carcass sunk deliberately on a documented date, researchers could track the entire process from the very first hour, watching each of the 3 stages unfold in precise, carefully measured detail rather than guessing backward from an unknown starting point. Sinking a whale carcass on purpose is not a simple task either. Teams needed permits, specialized equipment to tow a carcass weighing tens of thousands of pounds out to the correct location, and a reliable way to sink it in one piece rather than letting it drift apart before reaching the intended depth. Early attempts sometimes failed entirely, carcasses breaking loose or settling in the wrong spot, forcing teams to try again with adjusted methods until the process was reliable enough to repeat. The Japanese research team studying a sperm whale carcass sunk in Sagami Bay took this precision even further, using cameras that captured new images every 2 hours for 2.5 consecutive months. This revealed something nobody had previously noticed anywhere else. Many of the animals feeding on the carcass followed strict daily rhythms, becoming far more active at certain times of day and far quieter at others, patterns tied to daylight cycles happening thousands of feet above them on the ocean's sunlit surface. These planted whale falls confirmed much of what Craig Smith's team had already documented from natural discoveries. The same 3 stages, the same chemosynthetic bacteria, similar communities of specialized animals settling in over time. They also revealed real differences based on depth, location, and local ocean chemistry, proving that no 2 whale falls behave in exactly the same way, even when the broader process follows the same basic 3-act structure everywhere it happens. Most documented whale falls sit within a few thousand feet of the surface, in water shallow enough for research submersibles and remotely operated vehicles to reach with relative ease. The deepest parts of the ocean, the frigid, crushing depths beyond 10,000 feet, have remained almost entirely unexplored when it comes to searching for sunken whale remains, simply because so few vehicles on Earth can survive the pressure found down there. In the waters near Antarctica, researchers eventually documented a whale fall sitting at roughly 13,000 feet down, one of the deepest confirmed examples ever studied by any research team. At that depth, water pressure is crushing, more than 400 times the pressure found at the surface, enough force to instantly destroy most man-made equipment not specifically engineered to withstand it. Reaching this particular skeleton required equipment built for exactly this kind of extreme environment, remotely operated vehicles specially reinforced to survive pressure that would flatten an ordinary submersible in an instant. Even with the right tools, researchers described the dive itself as one of the most technically demanding expeditions their program had ever attempted, a reminder of just how difficult it remains to study most of the deep ocean even with modern technology. Despite the extreme depth and near freezing temperatures, the same basic pattern showed up once again, almost exactly as it had off the coast of California decades earlier. Scavengers had already stripped the flesh by the time researchers found it, and chemosynthetic bacteria alongside specialized invertebrates were busy colonizing the remaining bones, running the same sulfur-based chemistry already documented in far shallower water of California and Japan. The deep Antarctic seafloor, one of the most remote and hostile environments on the entire planet, was running the exact same biological process as a skeleton sitting a few thousand feet off the coast of Los Angeles. This consistency matters enormously to scientists trying to understand how widespread whale falls really are across the world's oceans. If the same basic ecosystem can form in relatively shallow California waters and in crushing Antarctic depth alike, it suggests whale falls may be happening constantly in every ocean basin on the planet. At every depth, whales are capable of sinking to, largely unnoticed simply because so little of the deep sea floor has ever actually been surveyed with any real precision, hidden not because they are rare, but because almost nobody has ever looked closely enough to find them. Only a tiny fraction of the global seafloor has been mapped in meaningful detail, and an even smaller fraction has been examined closely enough to spot something as specific as a whale skeleton resting quietly in the mud. Every confirmed discovery, from the original 1987 find to the crowded graveyard of Los Angeles to this frigid Antarctic specimen, may represent only the smallest visible edge of something happening across the entire ocean floor, constantly, invisibly, in numbers nobody has yet come close to fully counting. For every question whalefall research has answered since 1987, several more have opened up in its place, and honest scientists studying this field are quick to admit how much remains genuinely unknown. The overall global rate at which whale falls occur is still only roughly estimated, since researchers have no reliable way to survey the entire ocean floor and count every skeleton sitting undiscovered somewhere in the darkness. Some estimates suggest thousands of whale falls could be active on the seafloor at any given moment worldwide, while others suggest the number could be far lower, and without a way to survey the entire ocean at once, nobody can currently say with confidence which estimate comes closer to the truth. The missing Osedax worms found at several low oxygen sites remain an open puzzle, one researchers have not yet fully solved despite years of continued study. Whether the absence relates to oxygen levels, water temperature, competition from other species, or some entirely different factor nobody has considered, yet remains a genuine unknown. The kind of question that keeps deep-sea biologists returning to these sites again and again in search of an answer. The true scale of species loss caused by historical whaling also remains impossible to measure with any real precision. Scientists strongly suspect certain whale fall specialists went extinct before anyone had the chance to study them, but proving that suspicion definitively would require evidence that, by its very nature, can no longer exist to be found and examined. Even basic questions about how whalefall larvae travel between distant skeletons remain only partly answered. Researchers know roughly how far certain larvae can theoretically drift based on ocean current speeds and estimated survival times. But actually, tracking an individual larva across a real multi-year journey through open water has never been successfully accomplished, leaving a gap between what the models predict and what anyone has directly observed. Even the stepping stone theory connecting whale falls to hydrothermal vents, compelling as the genetic evidence supporting it has become, is still described by careful researchers as a strong hypothesis rather than a fully settled scientific fact. Confirming it beyond doubt would require tracking individual larvae across their entire multi-year journey between distant habitats, a technical challenge nobody has yet managed to fully overcome given current technology. None of this uncertainty diminishes what scientists have already learned since that first accidental discovery back in 1987. If anything, it does the opposite, revealing just how much more remains hidden in an environment covering more than half of the entire planet's surface. An environment humans have barely begun to explore in any real depth. Every unanswered question left dangling by whale fall research points toward the same conclusion. One final idea connecting everything documented across this entire story. An idea reaching far beyond Earth's own oceans entirely. Everything documented throughout this story points toward one striking conclusion. Life does not need sunlight to survive. It needs energy, and chemistry can provide that energy just as effectively as light does, given the right ingredients and the right kind of bacteria willing to make use of them. That single idea has become one of the most important concepts driving the modern search for life beyond Earth entirely. Scientists studying icy moons within our own solar system, particularly Europa, which orbits Jupiter, and Enceladus, which orbits Saturn, have found strong evidence that both worlds hide vast oceans of liquid water underneath miles of solid ice covering their surfaces. Sunlight cannot reach those hidden oceans any more than it can reach the bottom of the Santa Catalina Basin. If life exists in these buried alien seas, it will almost certainly have to run on chemistry instead of light, in a system that looks remarkably similar to what plays out around a whale fall right here on Earth. Both Europa and Enceladus are believed to have rocky seafloors sitting beneath their icy oceans, and scientists suspect those seafloors may host their own version of hydrothermal vents, chemical reactions similar to the ones found at Earth's vent sites and around decomposing whale bones scattered across our own ocean floor. If chemosynthetic bacteria can build an entire thriving ecosystem around a single dead whale in the pitch-black depths of the Pacific, similar bacteria could theoretically do the same thing around a chemical vent on the seafloor of a moon roughly 400 million miles from the Sun. This connection is not simply a hopeful comparison drawn by science communicators trying to make old research sound more exciting than it really is. Astrobiologists genuinely study whale falls and hydrothermal vents specifically because they represent the closest real-world example available of life thriving, completely independent of sunlight, right here on the only planet humans can currently study up close and in detail. Every whale skeleton sitting quietly at the bottom of an ocean basin becomes, in a strange way, a working model for what alien life on a distant moon might actually look like. Space agencies planning future missions to Europa and Enceladus have already cited chemosynthetic ecosystems like whale falls as a reason for optimism, since finding thriving life powered entirely by chemistry here on Earth suggests the basic recipe for life may not require a sun at all, only the right mix of water, chemistry, and time. A robotic probe drilling through miles of ice on a distant moon might one day find something not so different from what Craig Smith's team found resting quietly on the Santa Catalina seafloor back in 1987. A single death sinking through miles of freezing darkness, becoming a beacon for life that runs on chemistry instead of light, sustaining a hidden ecosystem for 50 years and counting. That process, first glimpsed by pure accident in 1987 and rediscovered on a massive scale off the coast of Los Angeles decades later, may end up being one of the clearest windows humanity currently has into how life could survive in some of the strangest, darkest oceans found anywhere in the entire solar system. The whale is gone. What it built in the dark is still teaching us exactly where to look next.